Wow, did everybody see Corbin up here and hear his prayer this morning? I think that's a first for him. Corbin, before long you'll be preaching up here. So that's good. Last Sunday we looked at a little tiny book in the Old Testament called Ruth. And we looked at a story that was an interesting story, but we kept having the question, didn't we? Why did God choose to put this book in the Old Testament, tucked in between the book of Judges and the book of 1 Samuel? And finally, we think we discovered the primary reason, at least, as we got to the end of the book of Ruth, when it told us that David was coming, that David was the son of Jesse. And it appears that that book was placed in the Old Testament to announce to everyone that the greatest king ever in the Old Testament was about to arrive. And thus we have begun a study, long study, in the life of David. Much of it takes place in the book of 1 Samuel. But as you move into the book of 1 Samuel, there are two or three other characters and incidents that we need to see, understand, as we finally make our way to David. So the first character is the man named Samuel. And Samuel will be the last judge over the period of the judges. And he may well have been the greatest of all judges. And he was a prophet of God. And he was outstanding in how he served God. But the story begins very differently. The story begins with a man whose name is Elkanah. And he has two wives, one named Peninnah, the other named Hannah. And Peninnah has several sons and daughters. But do you remember Hannah? She had no children. She was barren. Her womb was closed. And in that day and in that culture, it was very difficult for a woman who could not have children. She was not looked upon favorably. It was a stigma that she carried with her. It was an embarrassment. And in this particular family, while she was barren, her husband, it says, loved her more than he loved Peninnah. And he would give her more, double portion of things. And so in this family, they have a problem of jealousy. The story begins born out of jealousy that so often happens. And we all know about jealousy, don't we? Jealousy sometimes makes us say things and do things we would normally not say and do, and that's putting it kindly. I could say it like this. Jealousy just sometimes makes us mean people. Very mean. And Peninnah would provoke Hannah, and she would provoke her to irritation, and she would make life miserable in things that she would say. And Hannah is brokenhearted. She's greatly distressed. And this story says this went on for years. For years. And there's not a single thing that Hannah can do about it. She can't change what's happening in her body. She can't make the thing different in her family. She is stuck in a horrible situation. Except for one thing. Except for one thing. She can go to God and talk to God about her problem. And that's what she does. And so one day she's at the house in Shiloh where Eli lives, who is the judge that precedes Samuel. He's the prophet. He's the priest. He's the one who is God's spokesman. And she's there where Eli is. And I want to read what she says in her prayer while Eli is there. Once when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli, the priest, was sitting on a chair by a doorpost of the Lord's temple. In bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much and prayed to the Lord. And she made a vow, saying, O Lord Almighty, if you will look upon your servant's misery and remember me and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. She kept on praying to the Lord. Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart. Her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. We've all done that, haven't we? We've all prayed in our heart, a silent prayer. And I wonder how many times that our prayers, though they be silent, without us even realizing it, our mouths are kind of moving and making the word, and yet we're not saying the word. And Hannah's in great distress. And Eli is sitting in a chair watching. Now, he's the prophet of God. But he does what you and I so often do. He jumps to a conclusion. He jumps to a conclusion. He forms in his mind what he thinks is wrong with this woman. He has no facts. Though he's the greatest man of God we know at that point in time, he jumps to a conclusion and he confronts her and says to her, why do you keep being drunk like this? Why don't you stay away from the wine? And she will respond and say, oh, no. That's not what I'm doing. My heart is in great distress. And I'm speaking to the God of heaven about my distress. And Eli realizes that he had jumped to the wrong conclusion, just like you and I do so very often. And now Eli makes amends. He said, may the Lord grant to you the desire of your heart or the request that you've made of him. And she goes back home with her husband. And you can guess what happens, can't you? The Lord, after all these years of misery and all these years of pain, he opens her womb. She is now with child. And to her great delight, she brings forth this little baby boy, and his name is Samuel. Can you imagine? Can you begin to imagine the joy that overwhelms her? After all these years of torment, all these years of self-imposed shame, and sometimes not self-imposed, it was imposed by other people. And now she has a little baby. What a delight and what a joy. But, there is a significant problem. Do you remember the problem that we just read? She made a vow to God. And in that vow she says, if you will grant that I would have a son, I will give him to you. I will dedicate him to the Lord's service for all the days of his life. Oh my. That means this boy she's been waiting for, this child she's been waiting for, she's going to have to give away. What do you do when you've made such a promise? Well, here's what she did. At the age of weaning, and I don't know what age that is, Some people say it was about 2 years. Some people say it could have been 5 or 6 years of age. I have no idea. But if it was the 2-year mark, can you imagine Hannah holding that little baby for 2 years and caring for the little baby for 2 years, and the love that was overwhelmingly large in her heart toward that little baby? And now she makes a trip back to Shiloh. And she takes that young boy and she hands him over to Eli, saying, the boy is dedicated to God for all the days of his life. Oh, she would go visit him year by year and take him a robe that she had made and some clothes that she had made. But she's not going to watch him grow up. She's not going to tend to him while he's sick. She's not going to see him change as young boys change and experiment and play and do all those things, because he's going to be living with Eli. And yet, this is the man the Scripture says this about. Samuel grew in stature and in favor with the Lord and in favor with all men. Now, you may recall it's exactly what it says about Jesus when he's a young man. That Jesus grew in stature. He got taller, he got larger. And he grew in favor with God and grew in favor with men. Samuel becomes a great spokesman for God. He becomes a great leader for God. He is a giant of a man in God's service. And so the book of 1 Samuel begins with that little story. And you and I scratch our head and say, well, what do we do with the story this morning? How do I make that relevant to my life? And I will remind you that there is something in that story about jealousy that makes me think. It so easily happens, doesn't it? Jealousy. And it so easily happens, of all places, in families. In families. I suspect that every family represented here this morning has had to deal with it. Jealousy. And jealousy produces all kinds of turmoil and all kinds of distress, and jealousy just makes people mean. And yet we've been taught to stop comparing ourselves to other people, and we've been taught to be content with where we've been placed. Interesting part of the lesson. But there's far more to it than that. My favorite part is what we've been talking about for a long time now in this place. What do you do when life is so difficult and there is no answer? At least I can't find the answer. And she says of her own life, my heart is in great distress. I'm miserable. I have a major problem about which I can do nothing. I can't change anything. And if you have lived very long, maybe past the age of these little children that are here, they're young boys and young girls that are here, you have run into problems that don't have an answer that you can figure out. Am I correct? They just don't have an answer that you can figure out. And we sing a song, where can I go but to the Lord? And though it went on for years for Hannah, see, I'm not going to tell you that you get the answer immediately. It went on for years. Years. until finally God changed things and made things work. Do you know that Hannah went on to have 3 more sons and 2 more daughters? You know that God blessed her with more? But the idea of depending on God and trusting God is a mighty idea. And though the pain is not removed, by the way, do you remember Jesus? The night before he was killed? In great distress and anguish of heart, going to the Father, and he said, the Father with whom all things are possible, and begging. It didn't get changed, by the way. Not everything gets fixed. But he's the place to go. He's the place to go. So I see something about jealousy as we begin this journey with David in the life of Samuel, the life of Hannah. I see something about issues I just can't figure out and where to go. I got one more. It's harder. What do you do when you make a promise you don't want to keep? Or what do you do if you just make a promise that's difficult to keep? We just read in the Psalms this morning in our Bible class that when our hearts are troubled, vows come easily. We make promises easily. We make deals, as we called it this morning in Bible class. If you will give me a son, I will give him to you. It wasn't easy, but she kept her promise. Now, in 2 minutes, I want to give you one thought. When you and I were baptized into Christ's possession, as one person has put it, it was like kind of a wedding ceremony. Anybody remember their wedding ceremony? For some of us, that was a long time ago. But somewhere toward the end, someone said, do you promise? Do you promise to love her and cherish her and stay with her in times of health and times of sickness and times that are good and times that are bad, so long as you both shall live? And what did you say? Well, if you didn't say, I will or I do, that wedding didn't go well. Okay? So you said, I will. It's a promise. And someone has said, when you were baptized into Christ, it was kind of the I do statement. I will statement. I will have you be Lord of my life. I will follow you. But I'm going to tell you that's not an easy thing to keep either. There are all kinds of distractions. Satan is an enemy to that idea of my promise. And not a one of us does it perfectly. But what God is looking for is that now that I'm His child, I continue to honor my commitment. And I continue to walk in the light as He's in the light. I continue every time I mess up to say in my heart, I don't like it. I don't like what I've just done. It's called repentance. That's the life we've been called to live. It's the commitment that we made. And it's a lifelong commitment. And then when life is over, God takes us home. What a wonderful deal. What a wonderful deal. And so this morning, I'm glad you're here. I hope you're blessed by being here. I hope you understand the seriousness of making a promise before God. I hope you understand that when life gets really tough, there's one place you can always go. Because He loves you more than I cannot possibly describe. And these petty things like jealousy, they're just not worth it. It's not worth it. But I'm glad you're here. I'm going to sing a final song. If anyone needs to respond in any way, it's an opportunity. Let's stand and sing our song.